This is the final section of the lecture for week 5 of DM 703. In this section, we will go through just some key issues or some things for your consideration, as well as go through some definitions of some words that you may or may not be familiar with. The first thing I want to do is I want to talk about this whole aspect around colonialism, neocolonialism, post-colonialism, and ministry and relationship, because um, most of the time, even though this process usually pertains to missions and outreach, what we fail to recognize is that this process of transmitting the gospel or doing projects or whatever, in any way, when we are preaching to someone, in any way, when we are conducting a Bible study, anyway, most often we use one of these processes and when it comes to doing particular kind of work. And so I just wanted to kind of use these slides from with regard to the way that this is done from a missions and social justice outreach as sort of a way for us to think about. So I'm using another discipline to give voice to and maybe give example to how we put projects and things together, so that as you are thinking about your biblical interpretation, thinking about your theological reflection, and thinking about how you are designing and developing your projects, you might begin to think about how inclusive and ethical your approach is. So let's talk about this whole idea with regard to colonialism. And basically, the issue with colonialism is that, early on, uh, starts with Charlemagne, people have this justification that really that they are going to form colonies under the idea that basically what they're going to do is that it's a way of spreading the gospel to other nations. And really, the driving motivation, more than spreading the gospel, really is that we are going to claim territory, resources, and people. Um, Colonialism lasts for a long time and has definitely has an effect on us even today. And so, while even though the missionaries came with an activist and pragmatic spirit, by the mid 20s, they're looking at everything in terms of democracy and free enterprise. We're going to show people how to start businesses. We're going to take ministry from civilized, or we know best, to uncivilized people, so that uh, we could make other people quote unquote civilized. Basically, we can make other people like us. And the problem with this kind of approach is that one is you never give value to what the people are already doing. So it's really hard to learn from folks that you think you're there to help. You create a cultural genocide, because what you do is you wipe out at very deep levels people's processes for how they do certain things, or and you end up objectifying them. So you talk about the poor, the elderly, young adults, rather than identifying people for who they are as individuals beloved by God. And in that way, you do a certain amount of it. You can do a certain amount of violence, not violence so much that you're beating them, but violence and tearing down and tearing up their culture and who they are. With regard to B. There is a wonderful book by Michael Buddy called The Magical Kingdom of God that talks about how much this sending of American products like Coke and Pepsi, and even how much we've dispensed the gospel in particular ways has caused some harm in places that we didn't mean to cause it. We look at this idea around neocolonialism. What neocolonialism means is that mission is now free, has freedoms from errors of the past. It's not so much as creating these really oppressive structures and systems, um, but it's now outreach. And the issue is that the same mentalities are still in place. There's a benevolent paternalism and maternalism. I know better than you, so let me show you how to do this. And while I may affirm multiculturalism, I have a really hard time. So I'm glad to try things and to do different things. I have a really hard time when people that I go to help offer critique based on how I do things and based on my culture. That the second loop from Nubigen's communication and corrective aspect is not there. And so again, there is this objectifying the others, right? So I am consuming other cultures, I'm doing all of these other things. I'm not paying any attention to structures of power. So I may have a hard time understanding why folks are speaking out or using the gospel to assert privileges where they're speaking truth to power, or where they may be standing from a prophetic standpoint. Um, but I'm not aware, and I don't want to be aware of my own practices and theology. I don't want to call into question how I might see things and what I might believe. From the readings from the post-colonial Bible, one of the things that is clear is that the process of colonialism, in terms of reading and interpretation, basically what it did is it said that these Western ideals are best, and what we're going to do is we're going to put a localized dress on it. So we're going to, or and even not early on, not even do that. That it privileges Western ideals, try to put that in the context of how things are done, and then it takes over the cultural, the intellectual, the religious production of things, such that Western ideals are normalized. It's a totalitarian society with regard to Western ideals. We can see this with regard to British colonialism, with regard to Asia, India, Japan, and things like that, where certain ideals were that people dressed a particular way or carried themselves a particular way. We can also see that in the U.S. with regard to the schools that were created for Native Americans. Even you can think about it in terms of how much even the process of business with regard to what's the language of business, what's the dress of business, and those kinds of things. And want to say that even in the church context, we do the same thing. That there, in certain contexts, there's a certain thing as church clothes. There's a way that we sort of normalize our behavior and normalize our own reading interpretation of the text, such that anybody that disagrees with that reading and interpretation, there's something wrong with them. In terms of post-colonialism, what post-colonialists do is that they question the very structures, the way that we've been taught to read and to learn has embedded within notions around empire, nation, ethnicity, and language that are Western in their orientation. And so it scrutinizes and exposes colonial domination and power as embedded in biblical texts, theologies, interpretations, and it looks to see if there's an alternative hermeneutics. Is there a different way of reading this thing that overturns and dismantles colonial perspectives that are not in line with um, the gospel of Jesus Christ as presented in the Bible? And the biggest thing here is that from a post-colonial perspective, if you read through the post-colonial Bible, what it does is it allows formerly colonized people to read and interpret texts on their own terms and from their own locations. Um, a critical point that I want to lift here is that even, we talk a lot about post-colonialism. We usually talk about that with people from India, Asia, um, Latin America, Africa, and things like that. Often in the U.S., we forget that in many ways, people of color, women, and other people have also been colonized into a particular way of being. And that even though people may have cultural perspectives, that because of their education and learning, their class, and things like that, in some ways that they hold positions of what one could call honorary whiteness, that they are that they've taken on or have in their mind outposts, colonial outposts with regard to what is right, that they don't even know that they're there. They just have been taught that that's a common sense way to think about something. Um, Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci identified that as an issue as to why the proletariat never sought to overturn the bourgeoisie. He said that basically it's because all of the productions of common sense, how we learn, we watch TV, we share shows, we have a common knowledge around things, that those things begin to create in us a particular mindset about what's normal and what the aspirations are. And Gramsci asserts that the way that you help people break out of that is to have something called an organic intellectual who comes from a lower class but who is able to traverse all classes, who can associate with the colonizer as well as with those who have been colonized, so as to provide insight and wisdom and corrective, and to accurately see positions from the top and the bottom. If you remember our discussion on adaptive leadership, we talked about the ability to see from the balcony and the floor. When we think about missions as relationship, and I hope that you will think about your project from this perspective, basically the whole idea is that it's the most important thing is with regard to the relationship, so that it promotes learning from the other, and that it causes one to look at the relationships between power and privilege. It allows those who may quote unquote have be underprivileged or deserve it allows for their voices, for their knowledge to come forth. It even allows us to be in right relation with ourselves, to see where we might have let someone else's theology or biblical interpretation really silence our own voice and really serve to oppress us. Um, and basically, what we could say, it's not about what we're getting out of the project, but it is really steep this is ministry as relationship. It's really more about what is God doing in the encounter. So if you've listened to any of my lectures, you know that a favorite story of mine is Acts 10, the story of Peter, Cornelius, and the church. Basically, from a colonialistic standpoint, one could say Peter's going there to help get to convert Cornelius. Um, I would argue that no, Peter has an encounter with Cornelius because yes, Cornelius needs to hear the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. He needs an encounter with the Holy Spirit, but also that Peter needs the encounter with Cornelius because Peter and the Jerusalem church is racist, and they have um, wrong ways of interacting with Gentiles. And if the gospel is to break forth into a new era, that they have to get past those limitations in their own culture. The reason why this is so important, these issues around colonialism and neocolonialism, is easily exemplified in Robert Lupton's text, Toxic Charity: How Churches and Charities Hurt Those They Help. And he says, giving to those in need what they could be gaining from their own initiative may well be the kindest way to destroy people. We mean well, our motives are good, but we have neglected to conduct careful due diligence to determine emotional, economic, and cultural outcomes on the receiving end of our charity. Why do we miss this crucial aspect in evaluating our charitable work and, or I would say, our projects? Because as compassionate people, we have been evaluating our charity by the rewards we receive through service rather than the benefits by the served. We have failed to adequately calculate the effects of our service on the lives of those reduced to objects of pity and patronage. Wonder what would happen if we might be open, as were the early pioneers in feminist, womanist, mujerista, black, Minjung theologies. Wonder what would happen if we allow the people who are doing these projects with to find their voices. I wonder what would happen if we could find our own in the ways that Rosemary Ruther, James Cone, um, uh, and others found their way to really begin to assert, this is our voice, this is our context, this is how God is dealing with us. A term that you may come across as you are reading and thinking about this idea of an ethical and inclusive biblical interpretation is this idea of intersectionality. The term intersectionality was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, a civil rights activist and legal scholar. And what intersectionality looks at, it looks at how multiple forms of discrimination combine and overlap and intersect such that they cause a greater level of oppression because of the intersection of all of those things. Um, and So it's almost like when if you have two of those things going or three of those things going, then the experience, the oppression of the marginalized person is that experience of oppression is, rather than it being an additive factor, it's almost a multiplied factor. So I wanted to make you aware of that as you begin to do your work and your research and begin to think about the biblical interpretation you're doing. Also, there is quite a bit of work by Amy Jill Levine with regard to the anti-Judaism in biblical studies, and I bring this to the table because I think um, Amy Jill Levine, who is a professor at Duke University, makes an incredibly great point with regard to the fact that many Christians forget that Jesus was a Jew, and that there is this sort of idea that the Old Testament has nothing to say with regard to the New, or the Hebrew Bible has no way to inform what happens in the New Testament, and that basically what she argues is that because many of us have been educated by the West, we fail to appreciate the lens by which an understanding of Jewish culture and narrative keeps us from correctly interpreting biblical approaches. And one of the things that she really lays out, especially in her argument against, with regard to having a conversation with feminist theologians, is the fact that she has an article called "The Disease of Postcolonial New Testament Studies and the Hermeneutics of Healing," is that while while feminist scholars may be using this critical hermeneutical approach with regard to laying a corrective with regard to gender and race and maybe sexual orientation, because they leave out the historical critical method, because they only use one method of interpretation, they still buy into a narrative around anti-Judaism that's simply not there in the text. And so I want you to be aware of that depending on which biblical text you choose. Finally, one of the things that you had the opportunity to read was a small essay on this idea of queering the Bible and understanding queer biblical interpretation. Given all of the things that are going on with regard to all the mainline denominations, or a great many of them, with regard to LGBTQIA issues, thought it important to lift up this important aspect with regard to biblical interpretation, and to at least be aware of and see how does this idea of queering, what complicates, disrupts, and disturbs what we may think of as orthodox, by using work from other areas such as film, philosophy, literature, can reverse the hermeneutical flaw. I really like this whole idea with regard to the fact that the author talks about, rather than doing an exegesis, you read against it. What in the text may not be there or needs to be corrected by another voice. Maybe a way to parallel this again is to look at Phyllis Tribble's texts of terror, which look at texts that really are horrifying for women, and to really discern might those how might that give perspective in terms of this whole notion of queer biblical interpretation, and how might those ideas around um, a queer theology, or reading perspectives of queer biblical interpretation, how might that give us further insight into the biblical narrative, into understanding who God is and who God calls us to be, and how we construct our God talk or theology. Thank you. This is the end of our lecture for this week. Thank you and have a great week. Bye.